Alright, so today we're going to focus on something just a little bit different. We're going to do a side-by-side comparison of two contemporary models of couples counseling, both drawn from chapter 16 and 17 from Bitter's text, Theory and Practice of Couples and Family Counseling. These two models are emotionally focused counseling couples, developed by Susan Johnson, and imago relationship counseling, developed by Harville Hendrix and Helen LaKelly Hunt. Both are evidence-based practices. Both are rooted in attachment neuroscience, and yet they approach the couple's healing through a distinct and, I would argue, very complementary pathways. So the overall aim today is not necessarily to declare a winner, which one is most bestest. My aim is to give a thorough and in-depth analysis of each theory so that you can critically, clinically, and maybe even theologically think about both the lenses that resonate with you the most and why. All right, so let's start with the two models. what they share. So because that shared foundation is important, both EFC and Imago begin with John Bowlby. They both affirm what his attachment trilogy, published in 1969, 1973, and then later on in 1981, established that human beings are biologically wired for secured connection, and that when that security is disrupted, emotional and relational distress follows. Bitter notes that all three of the major contemporary couples models, Gottman, Johnson, Hendrix, Hunt, are rooted in the neuroscience that supports and confirms attachment theory. Stephen Porges' polyvagal work in 2017 is particularly relevant here. The idea that safety in relationship is not simply a psychological experience, but a nervous system experience. So both theories argue on the problem. Couples in distress are couples experiencing disrupted attachment. But where they diverge, and this is the interesting part, is in the conceptualization that disruption and what they do about it therapeutically. So EFC states, get into the emotion right now, in this room. Imago says, let's understand where the wound came from before we can heal it together. All right, so emotionally focused counseling has its origins in the 1980s when Susan Johnson and Les Greenberg were working together at the University of British Columbia. They began conducting what were, at the same time, fairly novel empirical studies asking a straightforward question. Does working with couples emotional experience actually produce better outcomes than behavioral intervention? The early answer was yes, staying present with the emotion, rather than bypassing it for behavioral techniques, produced measurably stronger therapeutic outcomes. This was significant in a field then dominated by cognitive behavioral approaches. Here's the interesting bifurcation here. So Johnson and Greenberg eventually diverged. Greenberg moved toward working with individuals. Johnson stayed with couples, and she found her theoretical home in John Bowlby's attachment framework. For Johnson, the question was no longer simply what are couples doing behaviorally, but what are couples experiencing in their attachment bond. So in 2008, Johnson published Hold Me Tight, which brought emotionally focused work to popular audience. She also established the International Center for Excellence in Emotionally Focused Therapy, ICEEFT, which has trained thousands of therapists worldwide. Today, EFC has one of the strongest evidence bases of any couples model, with multiple randomized control trials supporting its efficacy. So Imago relationship counseling has a richer and more eclectic theoretical ancestry than EFC. Harville Hendrix drew on psychoanalytic object relations, particularly the idea that we internalize relational patterns with early caregivers. He also drew on Jungian depth psychology, particularly the idea of the unconscious self projecting onto others, and he integrated developmental psychology to understand how childhood wounds shape the adult relational behavior. The word imago itself is Latin for image. Hendricks uses it to describe the unconscious composite image we form in childhood of the ideal other, a kind of internalized template assembled from qualities of early caregivers, both nurturing and the wounding. We spend much of our adult life, often unconsciously, searching for a partner who matches that image. In 1988, Hendricks published Getting the Love You Want, which became an enormously popular success and made imago therapy recognizable to the general public. What makes this historically particularly compelling, is what happened next. Hendricks and his partner Helen LaKelly Hunt, both internationally known as relationship trainers, found themselves in profound marital discord. They applied their own imago dialogue processes to their relationship. And the model, in a sense, saved their marriage. Bitter notes this explicitly as an illustration of the model's capacity for genuine transformation. So, with EFC, it says the primary problem in a distressed couple is disrupted attachment bond. Partners have developed negative interactional cycles. Most commonly, one partner pursues the other withdrawals. Both behaviors, Johnson argues, driven by attachment fear. The pursuer escalates because they're afraid of abandonment. The withdrawer shuts down because they are afraid of inadequacy or engulfment. This cycle is the problem, and the cycle is maintained by unexpressed primary emotions. Imago says the problem is developmental. Partners often unconsciously select each other because the other matches their imago, the internalized image of early caregivers. This is not a pathological choice, it's a meaning laden one. The partner who frustrates you most is, in imago terms, the partner who is calling you toward growth in precisely the areas your early life left unfinished. I want to add just with a quick note the view on love noted in the text. This is where philosophical differences become vivid. Johnson defines love as secure emotional bonding, the adult equivalent of infant caregiver attachment bond. For her, love is ultimately about emotional accessibility and responsiveness. Hendricks takes a more archetypal view. Love is unconscious, search for healing. The couple relationship in imago terms is not simply a bond of affection, but a vehicle of mutual wholeness. The therapist roles differ significantly between these two models, and understanding the difference matters for clinical training. In EFC, the therapist is primarily a process consultant and an emotional coach. Johnson draws on the client-centered and experiential traditions here. The EFC therapist follows the client's emotional lead. They don't impose structure on the content. What they do is track process. Where is the emotion? What's happening right now in this room between these two people? And then create conditions. What Johnson calls enactments, where partners can turn toward each other and actually speak the softer, more vulnerable things that they never would be able to say. The EFC therapist is functioning as a kind of secure base, a Bowlbian concept. The therapist regulated warm presence co-regulates the nervous systems of the two clients who come in activated and dysregulated. This is Porges' addition, like in clinical action, so to say. So in imago, the therapist is more explicitly an educator and facilitator. Session structure is more directive. The therapist teaches the Imago dialogue, a specific three-part process we'll look at on the next slide, and then guides couples through it, correcting errors, coaching, and helping partners access deeper meaning beneath the surface of their conflict. So, bitter notes here that no matter how directive family practitioners have been during their careers, many become increasingly collaborative as they age. So, both models ultimately move toward collaboration. They just begin from different positions on that spectrum. So both models ultimately share the same destination, a safe, secure, emotionally intimate couple bond. They are traveling different roads, basically to the same place. EFC is explicit about its goals in systemic terms. Johnson wants to reorganize the emotional responses that drive the couple's negative cycle. The target isn't just communication, it's the underlying emotional structure of the relationship. When partners can access and express primary emotions, the softer, more vulnerable ones beneath the anger and defensiveness, and when those emotions are received by the other partner, the bond changes, not just behaviorally, but neurologically. So Bitter captures this, I think, really beautifully in a summary of the EFC endpoint, the emotional connection, functional interdependence, safety and security, and a sense of belonging to each other. That's not just a better marriage, that's a Bowlby and secure attachment realized in adulthood. Imago's goals are perhaps more overtly developmental and spiritual. Hendricks and Hunt speak of coupling as a path to wholeness. The goal is simply to function better as a couple. It's two individuals who have used the crucible of their relationship to grow in more complete versions of themselves. The childhood wounds that brought them into conflict become the very material for healing. The language, wholeness, healing, growth will resonate differently depending on each other's clinical and even theological framework. So for those who are working in let's say biblical counseling contexts, there are meaningful resonances with themes of sanctification, relational restoration, and the image of God expressed in a covenantal partnership. So, and let's take a moment to just get real practical here. What do these theories actually look like in the room with a couple? So, in EFC, the therapist's primary tools are all about emotion. Empathetic reflection is not simply active listening, it's deep attunement, mirroring of a client's internal emotional experience. Johnson's RISSC acronym captures the quality of EFC interventions, and they are repeated, image rich, simple, slow, soft, and they use the client's own words. The therapist is slowing the couple down, not just speeding them up. So, heightening is one of the more distinctive EFC interventions. Rather than moving past an emotional moment, the EFC therapist stays in it, amplifies it, because it is a moment of genuine vulnerability. That the couple's bond can be reshaped and restructured. Restructuring those interactions means the therapist choreographs the enactments, again, to use their words. Can you turn to your partner and say that directly to them? The turning towards is the essence of the EFC. In Imago, the signature technique is the Imago dialogue. It has three movements: mirroring, the receiver paraphrases what the sender said, with the goal of accurate reception, not interpretation. So the validation, what you're saying makes sense to me, and here's why. This does not mean agreement, it means understanding. And empathy, I imagine you're feeling, dot, dot, dot. Inviting the receiver to extend imaginative care toward the sender's inner world. The behavioral change request is also distinctive. Rather than a complaint, you never listen, Imago transforms that into a request. 3 times this week, I would love for you to put your phone down and look at me when you're talking, or when I'm talking to you. Um, the request is specific, behavioral, framed in the sender's developmental need rather than in the receiver's failure. So Bitter uses a consistent case example throughout part 2 of this textbook. Again, it's the Quest family. This is a blended multicultural family navigating real complexity, step-parenting conflict, loyalty binds between the children and the biological parents, and the unresolved grief, and the communication breaks down. It's a rich case precisely because it doesn't resolve easily. One of the great pedagogical gifts of Bitter's structure is that you can watch each theory approach the same family and ask yourself, what does this theory see? What does it prioritize? And what does it miss? An EFC therapist working with the Quest couple would begin by mapping the negative cycle. Where does the pursuit withdrawal pattern show up? Perhaps one partner pushes harder around decisions involving the stepchildren, while the other shuts down and withdraws. EFC says beneath that push is fear, fear of being irrelevant, unloved, or shut down. Beneath the withdrawal is fear, perhaps of inadequacy or of the conflict itself. The EFC therapist work is to slow down that cycle, name the primary emotion underneath it, and create conditions for each partner to hear the other's vulnerability rather than just their defensive position. An Imago therapist with the Quest couple would take a different entry point. They would ask each other, who does this person remind you of? What developmental experiences shaped what you most need and most fear in a partner? The conflict around step-parenting is not just a parenting disagreement. It is the activation of an old attachment wound that the couple's relationship is uniquely positioned to either inflame or heal. So Bitter requires every theory chapter to conclude with a consideration of gender and multicultural issues. This is not per se just a footnote. It's a central lens. And it's one where both EFC and Imago show real strengths alongside ongoing areas of growth. EFC has a natural alignment with the feminist values. Johnson emphasizes on emotional access and responsiveness challenges, the culturally dominant pattern where one partner historically and statistically, more often the women, is over responsible for the emotional labor of the relationship. EFC invites both partners into the emotional access. That's equalizing in practice. At the same time, EFC therapists need to be careful not to assume the emotional expression takes a universal form. What counts as vulnerability in Northern European American cultural context may look quite different in Latinx, East Asian, or the indigenous cultural context. The Bowlbian framework of secure attachment is cross-cultural at the level of a neurobiological need, but its expression is culturally shaped. Imago began in a heterosexual context. Hendricks writing about husband-wife dynamics. So the model has expanded significantly to include same-sex couples and diverse relationship structures. The core concepts, childhood wounds, the unconscious search for a healing partner, the capacity for mutual stretching, translate well across relational configurations. But the structured dialogue format may feel constraining or artificial for couples whose cultural norms around communication are more fluid or indirect. So McGoldrick and Hardy simply remind us that effective family practice, ongoing attention to the ways of our theoretical frameworks carry embedded cultural assumptions. So both the EFC and Imago are still primarily developed within the Western educated and largely individualistic context. So let's consolidate what we've covered into maybe just like a clean summary matrix here. So this slide is designed as a quick reference point, something you can return to when you're trying to decide which lens is most relevant for a particular couple you're seeing. A few things to highlight from this comparison. First, the theoretical basis. EFC is relatively more parsimonious. It builds primarily on attachment theory and emotion theory. Imago is more eclectic. It draws on psychoanalytic, Jungian, developmental, and attachment frameworks. Neither is better. They reflect different epistemological commitments. Second, the evidence-based EFC has an unusually strong research foundation for relational intervention, including randomized control trials. Imago's evidence base is growing but remains more case-based and qualitative. For practitioners in settings that require evidence-based justification, managed care, VA context, academic clinical settings, this distinction matters practically. And third, session structure. EFC is more flexible and emotionally led. Imago is more structured and protocol driven. This is not just a stylus difference. It reflects the deeper assumptions about where therapeutic agency lives. In EFC, it lives in the emotional moment. In Imago, it lives in the learned skill of the dialogue. So we've arrived more at what I consider the most clinically important slide within this presentation. Bitter holds, and I share this conviction, that competing psychological theories often describe complementary aspects of the same phenomena. That is not a call to theoretical indifference, it is a call to integrative humility. So EFC and Imago are not opposing camps. They are, I would agree, looking at the same relational reality from different altitudes. EFC is working at the level of the present emotional experience, the nervous system, the here and now, the moment of turning toward. Imago is working at the level of the developmental history, the long arc of the person's formation, the patterns carried across generations, the wounds that predispose a person to certain relational configurations. What would integration look like in practice? Imagine being with an Imago framework in the early phase of treatment, mapping childhood wounds, psychoeducating about the unconscious partner selection process, introducing the dialogue structure. Then, as a couple begins to use that structure, your shift towards EFC, emotional tracking, to deepen the experience, to help the couple not just practice the words of mirroring, but actually feel the shift that happens when they are genuinely received by their partner. Imago's language of healing, wholeness, and mutual growth speaks to the theological themes of covenant, restoration, and sanctification. EFC's emphasis on safety, presence, and co-regulation of the nervous system connects the embodied theology, so to say, of the person. So the idea that healing is not merely cognitive, but somatic. So neither theory replaces the wisdom of the other, but both can serve as useful, even beautiful clinical tools in the hands of relationally attuned practitioner. All right, and here are the references.